Welcome everyone around the world, and thank you for joining the live broadcast. My name is James Alliband, Senior Security Strategist at VMware. I'm so excited to talk to you today about the latest Global Security Insights Report 2021. Now, just before I do introduce my two guests today, of course, I do want to remind you that we've got the Q&A running. This is where you're going to be able to speak and ask your questions. So Tom and Rick, of course, can answer those as well as myself. And on that note, it's a good time to introduce my guests. I am so excited, as always, to introduce, first off, Tom Kellermann, who is the head of Cybersecurity Strategy at VMware and member of the Secret Service Cyber Crime Board. And also, we've also got our very own Rick McElroy, Principal Cybersecurity Strategist, also at VMware. Thank you guys for joining me today.
Thanks, James.
Good to be here.
Guys, not only is it a pleasure always sitting on this virtual platform with you all, and of course we've got out live to VMware's main LinkedIn as well, which is a great moment for all of us. Before we jump into the report, I just want to level set and let's think about 18 months, maybe 12 months. But what do you guys think? Rick, we'll go to you yourself first. What do you think has been the biggest cybersecurity event to happen in this time period?
This is a tough question, only because there's been so many. I actually don't remember another time that's had this volume of big headline-making breaches. I mean, it could be said, especially after yesterday, that CNN is now the cyber news network because the coverage has gotten so massive, right? Which is good and bad, right? It's good that it's bubbled up to the level. It's bad. It's extremely bad that it's bubbled up. But I do think I'm gonna say the entire distrust that now occurs over our binary supply chain vis-a-vis SolarWinds, I think, and this question of trusting our digital supply chain and putting that at risk is the one I'm going to go with.
Yeah, it's such a pivotal moment, right? In that sense. Tom, how about yourself?
I would underscore that it is about supply chain attacks, but not limited to. SolarWinds didn't occur in a vacuum, and more often than not, adversaries are leveraging attacks to island hop through your infrastructure. I mean, the game has changed. The adversaries now want to commandeer your digital transformation and use it to attack your constituencies. Whether or not you're in the technology space is irregardless. And then you see this dramatic evolution in organization of these threat actors to form these cartel-like structures where they actually provide services like access mining or specific access to compromised corporate networks.
Yeah, it's just crazy how, like, I know Rick, you and I spoke yesterday about the sheer level of the economy now that the cybersecurity and the bad actors have $1.5 trillion, as I know you said yesterday. It just really changes our mindset into really what we're looking at.
Yeah, and look, Cybersecurity Ventures says 10 trillion by 2025, which is almost a 10x increase. That's wild. Like we got to start busting this economy up.
I couldn't agree more. And look, also as well, like the disruption, of the pandemic, of course, along with where we're all sitting today with the anywhere workspace that we do have and the anywhere workforce, as we spoke about with SolarWinds, it resulted in that surge in cyber attacks and material breaches, and of course that opens up a whole new world for security teams. The blind spots, the lack of visibility, the highlighting in vulnerabilities. Rick, do you want to just talk about who we surveyed in the report and why we did the report itself as we talk about the Global Insights report?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, James. Yeah, look, we went across 14 regions and countries. We surveyed 3,500 plus CIOs, CTOs, and CISOs with the goal of trying to get a reasonable sense of cyber ground truth, right? We start to look at some of our other reports. We start to couple that with our global incident response report, which has a look of all of the breaches that our investigative teams are looking at across the globe. And I think it starts to paint a fairly realistic picture. And then, of course, myself, TK, you, James, a whole bunch of people at Card Black, we get to meet with a lot of these teams, right? And so my goal has been validating the data in the data set when I meet with CIO roundtables, CISO roundtables, and thus far I've received, no pushback on some of these numbers that we'll get into, right?
Absolutely. And TK, just for all of the listeners, before we jump into the report itself, what do you think our listeners should really look when they're going into the report, look to take out of that report itself?
This is all about brand protection now. You have to defend against an adversary that wants to commandeer your infrastructure and use it to attack your constituencies. And you're more vulnerable than ever because of your adoption of modern applications and modern cloud environments, and because of your utility of telework. And you need to remember that these cyber crime cartels were empowered by the pandemic. Because traditional organized crime couldn't operate due to the lockdowns, they began to migrate online, which is why you have more and more a myriad of service offerings like ransomware as a service, where traditional criminals can get in the game of providing ransomware attacks. And so with that backdrop, you need to pay attention to what is the most valuable thing you have. And the most valuable thing you have is your brand. And if it were to misuse to attack your customers, that is worst case scenario.
Yeah, like it's interesting, isn't it? And I'm stepping away from cybersecurity, and I know it's something that for our European listeners, they would have seen. But I think to help level set and to kind of see how we can relate from this, just look at what happened with Cristiano Ronaldo the other day with Coca-Cola, and he moved it away, and there's a drop in the share price. And this is, think about that correlating to cyber attacks, and just to frame that for our listeners here. That's really the mindset that we should be in. Is like that's the effect, and this is how quickly it can happen as well. From a stakeholder like Ronaldo to major cyber attacks, and Rick, you mentioned SolarWinds earlier.
It is that reputational impact that is most concerning to the folks that contributed to this study. But I think it's even more pronounced when you look beyond the breach and you realize that the burglary has now become a home invasion per se.
I think that's a great way to summarize it, definitely. And TK, on that note as well, let's start talking about some of the key findings that we pulled out of the report. Is there, before we kind of dig in, is there one that you want to highlight that you think was like one that really caught your eye as you started to go through the findings?
I mean, it was notable that folks are very concerned with the construct of cloud security and cloud attacks and the future of what we call cloud jacking. It was notable that was a true priority for them to be able to harden that environment, to be able to detect and respond in that environment. And Rick, you've got great thoughts on that, so I'd love to hear more from you.
Yeah, well, look, it seems to be a double-edged sword, right? The cloud allowed us to implement security solutions that exist at the point that users interact with the technology, whether that's cloud content filtering, cloud firewalls and VPNs, secure access service layers, like all of these things, right? That it really took for us to send all of our employees home across the globe and continue to keep people up and running. But it also caused visibility gaps, right? So as we start to think about cloud and cloud workload security, that's different. When we look at the respondents of the survey, over 60% are saying that workload is now the most vulnerable point in that data journey. I think that's significant. I think that means we need to focus around workload security. I think secondarily, my other thought on that is there's a whole lot of vendors that are taking, the same solution and rinse and repeating, whether it's a workload security, whether it's mobile security, whatever the case may be. Look, our philosophy is different. That has to be custom built, ground up to address specific workload threats. And they are, in fact, different than endpoint threats. They're different than network threats. And so I think what CISOs are really looking for is some vendors, some solutions out there that can give them the visibility into these cloud environments. But not only that, ensure that as they chase cheaper costs in the cloud, which we know CIOs are going to do, that those controls are uniform, they're auditable, and they can move around these various cloud environments as their data does. That's what they're really looking for.
Yeah, and one of the areas, and Rick, just touching on that, I also want to talk about attack volume as well. And from your point, of course, naturally, we've jumped into this work from anywhere position, and we're likely going to continue in that sense quite naturally as we've learned to live like this. But from your point, do you think the attack volume has expanded, and do you see that continuing to expand following from these findings?
I do, and I would say it generally jives with everybody that I talk to, right? Almost everybody has had to deal with, especially very early in the pandemic. So there was a bit of a curve, I think, to the increase. But I want to rewind the tape a little bit to explain some of the reasons for this increased volume. So if we rewind the tape to 2016, the year of ransomware, right? And we all know it really kicked off the era of ransomware. When you look at that, what happened? Well, you had these threat actors, you had these cyber criminals that started to build infrastructure around this, right? What they actually started to do is do startup models on various criminal enterprises. So TK mentioned a few of them. Access mining, crypto jacking, getting access to a group of systems, footprinting those systems, and then selling access to someone else, selling credentials. And so what was built on the backside of all of that is a massive infrastructure that was then leveraged during the pandemic to fuel, this rise in pure volume, right? So, secondarily, I would say this massive increased attack surface where we sent all of these users home who, children were accessing the same secure work computers to go to school. I have Alexa devices or Google Home or Rings or whatever the case may be. I'm not picking on any one particular IoT vendor. I'm just saying that those are now included in the perimeters of our security programs. I think all of that has really fueled the level of volume that we're seeing.
There's a lack of digital distancing in homes, and really we need to pay attention to that as individuals, as members of society. Your work device should not be on the same network as your smart devices, period. But to Rick's point, I think it's very important to underscore something. In 2015, a Pax Mafioso was created between specific governments in the world and their very best cyber criminals, where they were treated as national assets, and that allowed them to act in an untouchable fashion. And these cyber crime cartels began to evolve from there. But most importantly, I want to point out something. So if Rick builds a custom piece of ransomware today, hypothetically, it'll have 14 different evasion techniques built in. It'll have a rootkit capability built in, right? And he will sell that to me or let me use that, lease that service so I can make some money. But the reality is I become Johnny Appleseed for Rick, because any environment that I hit with that ransomware, he can immediately literally teleport into that environment vis-a-vis the rootkit. And so I'm running around colonizing the world for Rick. And we need to remember that when we think of the attacks of today.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a great...
And you go ahead, Rick. You go ahead.
I was just going to say, James, you just covered this. You were on live with Singapore media, right, recently, where you talked about the phenomenon of an insurgency. Well, TK nailed it. That's what we're talking about. When you hear us blog about it, when you hear us talk about it, it's the fact that our own infrastructure is being colonized and used against us. My constituents and partner networks are now attacking each other. And that's crazy, right? So I think we do need an effort to civilize our own cyberspace and our own infrastructure inside of North America, as well as other sovereign nations need to do that as well.
Absolutely. And I don't want to just jump into what we think we should do next in that sense, because there's one area that I think, and Tom, jumping back onto yourself, is do we think that cyber attacks have become more sophisticated, or do we think the attackers necessarily have become more sophisticated? I know you can certainly talk to this.
Yes. Hands down, yes. Majority of malware released in the wild today is customizable and customized. In addition to that, the average adversary is spending a couple of weeks conducting reconnaissance on your infrastructure prior to launching attack against you. If you look at modern ransomware in today's environment, it'll hit you through your backups first, and it won't immediately detonate. And you have to remember that. If you think about the fact that we've had more 0 days released into the wild this year than the last 3 years combined, it's mind-boggling that highlights the nexus between specific governments, intelligence services, and cyber criminal groups. There is a protection racket going on there, because many times governments view these groups as a way to offset economic sanctions and a way to create proxies, to create almost an insurgency against their geopolitical enemies.
No, absolutely. And one of the results that came out, one of the findings that came out, which I just found truly staggering, and Rick, kind of jumping over to yourself here, is 81% have suffered a breach within the last 12 months, and they experienced an average 2.35 breaches. Why do we think that's happening? And moving forward as well, what do you think we need to do next when we start with dealing with staggering results like that?
Yeah, well, I think it speaks to time to remediate. Right. So I do think we're getting better about identification of issues. GDPR California Privacy Act, all of these things have helped fuel disclosure rules, right? Great. We're seeing nation states now get involved to change legislation to demand that companies, are actually transparent about this, right? Which is all part of the problem. We're still, I think, measuring just how big it is. When you start to think about the complexity that it takes to perform modern security, right? To put together the full context of what the attackers are doing, to actually see things like reconnaissance that are occurring inside of your environment on a regular basis, for 1 to 2, 3 weeks. Like we have to push left of that, right? And so I think what we have to do is start simplifying security. That's number one. We gotta use less tools. There's just too many tools that have too many gaps, and we really need to spend our time on a common set of tools where we can tune those on a regular basis. We're comfortable that they're stopping 85% of the things, and then I have great responses to the rest that happen to leak through that infrastructure, right? But I think. The cyber arms race is not going to stop anytime soon, and I will hang the sophistication and the rise in sophistication clearly on. It's a cyber arms race. So whoever has the best munition or the best capability wins in the end, and that's the mindset of a whole bunch of people on the offensive side, right? And so for defenders, we have to remember that, right? But there are some effective things you can do to start shifting left of ransomware and looking at all of this stuff that occurs from a pre-executable perspective that they're doing. Look, Conti, this is one everyone's talking about. Well, what is Conti doing? They're actually doing credential harvesting 10, 20, 30 days prior to launching the ransomware attack. Now that I have those credentials, now that I can laterally move, now of course my ransomware is going to hit 3, 5, 1,000 systems. That's what they want, right? And so you got to start paying attention to your identities, and you got to push that visibility into those areas before they start to execute the malware payloads.
I would add to that. Remember, they're going to inject into memory and compile on host. So do you have visibility into the memory space? Once they do that, they're going to leverage counter incident response. They're going to disable AMSI. They're going to disable security controls, which is why tamper prevention is a key evolution of our product lines. In addition to that, they're going to manipulate time through Chronos attacks. They're going to try to manipulate the time associated with the logging of the events to obfuscate their activities. And finally, they will deploy a secondary C2 on a sleep cycle. So don't immediately terminate the original C2. And what's worse is they're doing that through the involvement of steganography, where they put the code and the image files themselves. So yes, that's your challenge. You need to assume that prevention will fail at some point, and when it does, how quickly can you detect and respond? But when you do respond, be more clandestine in how you respond, because you don't want it to escalate as destructive attacks are up 118%.
Absolutely, and Tom, on that point, because we do have a question I've seen, and I want to jump into a few Q&As as we're going through the session today. One of the people tuning in has asked, so this sounds like a reason to stay away from public cloud and then deploy in the private cloud. Do you think that's correct, or what should we be looking in the public cloud to help us actually secure this environment?
Not all public clouds are equal, number one. Remember, public cloud is a very nice apartment building in a very tough neighborhood, and you will always be responsible for the security of your apartment, for the security of your guests, and you can't make assumptions vis-a-vis your neighbors or the phenomenon of the building itself. Workload security is an imperative, but also the endpoints that access that environment and the security of those endpoints will be an imperative, like obviously modernizing and moving to next generation AV and EPP platforms. But quintessentially important, I think, is this construct of regularly conducting threat hunting in these environments to look for anomalous behavior prior to that manifesting and creating that threat against you. Rick?
Yeah, dude, I think you used a great analogy. Everyone builds, their digital transformations with this idea that it's a civilized neighborhood, and it's absolutely not. In fact, you have neighbors to your scenario, TK, that are listening to what you're doing inside of your apartment, right? And so it is incumbent, I think, on us. And look, James, I won't give you a definitive answer either way on that, unless I'm in the environment and I can see a whole lot of things. So I don't have a blanket recommendation. My only blanket recommendation is trust but verify those public clouds. If they're performing controls on your behalf, incident response investigations, whatever it is, like that has to be in the contracts. So there is, I think, a bit of information security teams and CIOs going back through these contracts to understand the responsibilities during an event, and then say, do they even have access to the data an incident response team would need if you were hit with a breach and that breach bubbled up to something like material, which is very helpful when you're pre-planning. When you sit down with your incident response partners, which you should all be doing, you should have a conversation with some incident response firm. We're partnered with plenty of them that are great. Have a retainer, but bring them in. These are discussions that you're going to need. What data are they going to need access to? How fast can they get it? How fast can they push out sensors if you don't have them? How fast can they get access to your cloud SIM? All of these things are going to matter when you're actually trying to scope what happened to your brand and then clearly explain that to the public, because the public now demands that you're transparent about how you disclose this, along with governments, which are starting to demand it. But we're missing like this whole pre-planning phase in incident response, waiting for the breach, and then kind of calling 911, and they go, we don't have recordings. We have no idea what happened for the last year, right? Even for the last 30 days. And so those are things that are in our control today, and the conversations we should be having with our general counsels and CISOs to try to get some money into that bucket and go through these tabletop and planning exercises.
Yeah, I think reading into reports as well, I think what's certainly encouraging is we're seeing that 43% of respondents are building more security into their infrastructure. And certainly what I'm taking out of that, both of your answers, is like, look, you've got to secure these environments from the get-go and build that into your strategy. Like that's paramount. If you don't do that, you're making mistakes down the line. And of course, with that as well, like 98% already use or plan to use cloud-first security strategy as well. And I think that also is such a paramount importance there. And Ricky spoke about it as well. And I kind of want to touch on this, is how we can solve those multiple use cases using and breaking down not only silos but also reducing the amount of tools that we're using. If you want to just add to that a little bit further into why should we be doing that?
Yeah, the history of InfoSec is throwing a problem at, throwing a solution at something after the problem's already existed for a long time. Right? I mean, it could be argued, look, the EDR market, if you just took that alone, we had a visibility gap for 20 years before EDR showed up, right? And so it's like all it was doing was addressing some gap, which means we're still building our technology, to use TK's analogy. You have your architects that come in and they're planning for things like plumbing. They're planning for things like power, right? They're planning for things like, a big enough square footage, right? All of the stuff that IT teams do. What aren't they planning for? They're not planning for somebody to run into that apartment building and kick your door in. They're not planning for that. That's our jobs, right? That's where we need to start to bring the two teams together with a common data set and a common language. And so for far too long, IT is speaking one language and we're speaking MITRE ATT&CK. Like that gap needs to be addressed. Now, how do we start to do that? We have to provide common telemetry across our infrastructure, common threat intelligence, and how that works amongst a product set, right? Look, if my firewall's speaking a completely different TI language than my endpoint, I got a context gap that I can't close, and I need humans to do that. As we start to drive, software that's actually speaking the same languages, that can see the context of an attack that starts on a network with some sort of, recon or ping, and eventually ends up with a piece of malware being launched in my environment. That, I think, is what we're all shooting for as an industry. And so that's the problems that we're focused on. It's really around this context of, I have an entire kill chain. Most people are focused on the far right of this kill chain. How can we expand this data set and visibility, and then get better with things like data analytics, ML, to help fuel this at scale, right?
And if you're really heavy on network security and you believe that's the answer to the challenge that we face, just remember something. Adversaries love to ride those tunnels, okay? They love to ride that VPN tunnel and the implicit trust you place in it from the endpoint into your infrastructure. Look how many 0 days came out this year for VPN providers alone. And because of that, you really need greater telemetry on the endpoint to assess when a behavioral anomaly manifests. In addition to that, because of the 0 day phenomenon, yes, we're going to get hit by 0 days. Yes, they will effectively cause a breach. But can you detect and respond after the exploit detonates? I mean, that's really what you need to be solving for. And how you
and TK, can you limit it to the thing that it exploded on instead of the entire data center?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's what we're talking about.
How resilient.
Yeah.
Exactly
and we have to draw a line of defensive debarkation somewhere. Right. And so it's like when you start to think about those critical systems, those critical assets, you got to start looking at like disruption in depth models, right? Active defense when they're inside of your environment, being able to go after them. Look, hack back, offensive security, all that stuff, whatever. That's not in our control. What's in my control is what I do to an adversary when they're in my environment. And there are a ton of wicked awesome technologies out there to help you support that.
Yeah, there's deception technology, and then there's poison pills where you can basically frag your own data when it leaves your environment. These are all things that are acceptable under international laws, under international norms. There's no reason why your data has to remain the same when it's exfil.
Absolutely, I think that's key. It's how can you kick back as well? And I think you brought up an interesting point of how resilient are you to a cyber attack as well? I think that's really what that for me is what changes the narrative here. It's not necessarily looking at, can we just stop the cyber attack? Okay, great, you may be able to. Again, how as Rick you quite rightly said is okay, great, but if your network gets attacked, what's the spread load there? But also, how resilient are you to a cyber attack? Can you recover? What's the material breach here for us? How much does that take? What does the payload do to us? And I think one of the interesting results that came out and really jumping into over the findings, but taking us forward into what we should do next is if 56% TK fear material breach in the next 12 months, what should they be doing next?
Well, number one, this report really highlights that CIOs and CTOs came to Jesus this year with the importance of security, and the sustainable development of their digital transformation will be dependent on the work of the CISO. And so what they should be doing next is they need to be briefing their boards and their CEOs that the game has changed, the problem has changed. You don't want the brand to be impacted. You don't want to be sued because your infrastructure was used to attack your customers. And with that, the only way you solve for that is really rolling out zero trust from inside out and applying those zero trust principles, beginning with increased visibility and telemetry, following through with detection and response across your infrastructure. The challenge is there's too many security controls and widgets that people are using, many of which can be undermined and tampered with by adversaries, and none of which can effectively communicate with one another because they haven't been integrated. And so you should really standardize on one platform. Whatever platform that is, you should standardize on it soon.
Rick, how about yourself?
Yeah, my famous advice, and I've been saying it for 3 years, maybe longer, and I'll continue to say it, MFA, right? So again, going back to this idea of a zero trust. Well, look, I'm not a fan of just everything at once, right? So again, pick those critical systems, pick those critical identities, and give yourself a foothold to then start taking the rest of the hill, right? But you got to have some reliable, trustworthy foothold to do that. However, what are we seeing where MFA is breaking down? Well, it's being implemented a little poorly. We're not auditing self-provisioning of MFA accounts, and attackers are savvy. They completely understand how that works. And so they're using that not to bypass an existing control, but it's like we put a weakness in place. So I think I'm going to say MFA, but I'm going to change this a little bit to start looking at our processes that actually happen inside of InfoSec, right? Because those processes are often being used against us. And that's another area that was highlighted as part of the report is it wasn't so much that it was ransomware. Of course, ransomware is massive, but the precursor to that is the foundation of our IT is built poorly. It's got cracks in it. We can't address patching fast enough. Third-party applications still remain an issue. Visibility and those, prevention of those being misused, all of those good things. And so I do think focusing around the identity for a while is going to yield some fruit for teams.
And I would also suggest here that just-in-time administration is of paramount importance. No one should have administrative rights in perpetuity. And the fact that most organizations have not integrated their network security capabilities with their endpoint protection platforms seamlessly to correlate that telemetry is highly problematic, which is why threat hunting should be conducted on a much more regular basis across those critical assets that Rick has identified.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I'm going to take the point around improving visibility and improving a resilient cyber resilience as well. And taking the 2 points that you guys have brought up today, for me, it's improving your visibility and making sure that cyber security is a board level problem to make sure that it hits the board. I couldn't agree more, TK. For me, it's so powerful and it has to be done. And this is the pivot point. I think attackers are opportunists, so we have to be opportunists as well. We have to change the status quo, and we have to make sure that the traditional security processes we have in place aren't necessarily going to affect us for the future. And I'm just reading a few of the comments that have come through as we've been speaking. And Mike White, TK, says, if attackers can't get paid, they'll look elsewhere. Where exactly are they looking? And do you think that's necessarily true?
So when it comes to ransomware, I think that could be true if ransomware payments were banned and they were likened to essentially terrorist financing, which because they've been reclassified as terrorists by the Department of Justice, right? But I think that more importantly, there's so much value in non-public market information, non-public strategies of corporations. There's so much value in terms of what you can steal from an organization and use illicitly in the markets, that they will always get paid. And most importantly, the future of competitive intelligence is hacking. Your competitors are hacking you too. I don't believe that all the righteous corporations in the world are not doing this. And so this is a natural evolution of, I guess, this nexus between the physical world and the digital world. And it's high time we prioritize cyber.
No, I think that's a great point. And Rick, stepping us forward and just wrapping up today's session before Tom, I've got an area that I do want to bring up with yourself. It's very pivotal this week as well. But Rick, if there's one thing that our respondents can take out the report, and looping this back around to what we spoke about earlier, Rick, what do you think they need to take away, and what things should they really be presenting to the board to say, this is a problem and I need help with this?
Yeah, look, I think the one takeaway is we're in the middle of the storm and we're not all in the same boat. I think a lot of times you hear security people, we're not in the same boat. Some people have more money, some people have more financing, some people have more people, some people have less people. Like the boat varies, right? That being said, this storm is going nowhere anytime soon. And so if you're having a board level discussion, brand protection of that customer data, I think it's something that they care about. Ransomware for two verticals in particular, and then now it's spreading out to critical infrastructure as well. So healthcare, what are they focused on? Ransomware. Unfortunately, and this is something that we're going to have to deal with as security professionals and leaders, we are microscopically focused on the ransomware problem right now. And ransomware is just another symptom of, again, a whole bunch of things that we've gaffed off over the years, and it's none of our faults. Right? I've done it. We've all made, security trade-offs and discussions. But what do we have to do? We have to realize that this is the norm and it's not going to change anytime soon. If I can start to shift my mindset and realize I do live in a bad neighborhood and I'm responsible for my own self-defense, then I'm going to change my own behavior. I'm going to change the culture of the organization that I'm with. And to do that, I need something like a neighborhood watch, right? So embracing our ISACs, embracing this new movement towards, real-time intelligence sharing out of organizations to governments and then back to organizations so we can all benefit. Those are all things we do in the real world. We just haven't done them in cyber. And so I think, look, education is key and being realistic about these threats to our boards. But the other thing I will say is I can say after meeting with so many teams and so many security leaders over the last 18 months, we are empowered. You are seen as a business leader now. We helped organizations stay up and stay running during a global pandemic. The organizations are happy, with a lot of the security leaders and the way we were able to do that. Let's take advantage of that, just like the attackers are taking advantage of this disaster. And let's put a flag out a little further than we ever thought was achievable, because I think there's an appetite inside of corporations to do it now.
Yeah, I think that's, as I said earlier, and I can only agree on that, is use this opportunity and make, real positive outcomes for yourself here. And Tom, just to wrap up today, because of course, President Biden has met with the Russian President Vladimir Putin as well this week in Geneva. And of course, there was a lot of talks about cybersecurity, cyber attacks, and the areas that we need to focus on as well. And not only is this making top level headline news, but also what was your take home from those meetings?
Well, first, I will quote Vladimir Putin, where he said the majority of attacks originate in the West or in the U.S. And that may be true because so much of our infrastructure has been colonized and is being used to attack everything. But more importantly, I think preceding that meeting, the fact that NATO revised Article 5 to say significant cyber attacks against critical infrastructures against NATO members could be seen an attack against all, and they will respond. And I think President Biden necessitated that galvanization of NATO and the redrafting of Article 5 to go into the meeting and lay out the red lines. And the red lines were, we have 16 critical infrastructures. If they are disrupted, if they are attacked, we will respond. And for too long, the U.S. has been taking it on the chin. For too long, the U.S. has had their hands tied behind their back. And I really think this was a historic moment yesterday.
Yeah, and I think, I know it's one thing that we've spoken about in the past, and I want to ask you here while we're inside this forum, is it about time that we treat cyber criminals as terrorists and have pretty much the same rules and regulations in place?
Only those that are launching destructive attacks.
Yeah, and I would stipulate the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act in the United States needs to change and needs an update stat. And you can clearly see this because some of the cases that have been that they're using, are cases where someone used their own login to access data, right? And so I think in particular to the United States, I'm hesitant to say that before we change that because honestly, if we did that today, a bunch of security researchers would get swept up in that as well. But I do think that's one of the definitions that we need, along with some definition over cyber terrorism, cyber warfare, and intelligence gathering, and where those all start to blend, right? It's just, we don't know today.
No, I think that's absolutely fair. And we have had a few of the questions come through the Q&A as well. So I'm going to jump through this and, let's jump into them. So first and foremost, as we keep improving our cybersecurity systems, hackers are going to improve their ways as well. So how can we make sure we're ahead of the curve on this one? Rick, do you want to jump into this question?
I'm going to put on my attacker hat because I used to do this, right? So you have to think about how these attackers are doing this at scale. They're running a business. They have QA teams, they have developers, right? Well, how is your business impacted when, some developer makes a piece of code and that code doesn't work and then everybody's got to scramble, right? So what we're doing is like they're automating as much of this stuff as possible. That's why. So we have to interrupt their automation cycle. And so if you think about it in a kill chain perspective, whether you're familiar with a linear kill chain or something like the cognitive attack loop that TK and I and James talk about, which is more of a cyclical nature. Well, there's so many steps in there where we have room to actually interrupt these attackers. And here's what's crazy. If I can push my disruption as far left of that, meaning during the recon phase, during the weaponization phase, and make them take manual activity. Imagine if every single piece of ransomware that had to land on an endpoint was custom written. Now we're starting to bust up that economy. Now they actually can't get a massive ROI because their time investment is too high. And so simply put, we have to make them spend more time. And there are a number of different ways we as a collective group and then we as individuals who run security programs can do that. But that's the biggest thing. It's like, man, we got to deploy some tech to start making it harder and making them actually have to use those 0 days, which, again, to point back to the 0 day issue, I would argue we have raised some defensive boats. Because, the fact that they're having to use 0 days that cost $500,000 or $1 million to R&D, that should tell us we're on the right path. Let's speed that path up. We just got to get there faster.
Tom, another one of the questions that came out following the meetings between President Biden was Jonathan McBurney asked, state-sponsored cyber attacks need to be considered as an act of war. The NATO update, he thinks, is a step in the right direction, but not enough to deter. So he thinks there needs to be a rework to the risk and reward formula. What's your thoughts on that?
It's all about proportionate response. And for too long, the West has not even responded in a cyber vein to these threats. I do think that destructive cyber attacks, integrity attacks, or wiper attacks, or ransomware attacks, non-PETIA style, against Western critical infrastructures, as we saw against U.S. hospitals this fall by specific threat actor groups in Eastern Europe, should be considered delineations of red lines. I do think it's high time that international law enforcement begin to take the gloves off and launch disruptive cyber operations against the dark web infrastructures of the truly notorious groups who we all know who they are.
And TK, I would just second that by saying, much like we do at narco task force across the globe, that money should be earmarked for more law enforcement and more interaction amongst nations, right? Because I just saw a point that was raised, right, which is we have existing laws that aren't being applied. Well, if I'm going to do an infrastructure takedown for TrickBot or some other group, that infrastructure may actually be one of my partners inside of my country, right? Like that's going to get a little wild if we start to take that approach. But I do think like it's not about just applying the laws, but like we have a bottleneck inside of law enforcement, inside of DFIR, inside of investigations, and so it's like that's where we need to earmark some dollars is around. Again, maybe it's new agencies, maybe it's not, but law enforcement is feeling it. And look, this is just one of the cyber problems. They're investigating, all of this other really bad stuff, and they are getting burnout along with the incident response teams. And so I just think we're going to have to fuel that with some of the money that comes from these takedowns.
Agreed. Forfeiture laws need to be modernized, and exchanges that are complicit in laundering the proceeds of cybercrime or child pornography, those funds should be forfeited and used for grants for critical infrastructure protection.
Tom, also with that, because Lakesh has just asked a question around, should organizations restrict downloading third-party apps and maintain a centralized base of all whitelist applications?
I would say yes, but then again, every organization is different. And I understand the development community's needs as well. I do think DevSecOps is an imperative nowadays. I think a lot of people put too much faith in the fact that Kubernetes will manage and secure whatever they roll out from a container perspective, and it's insufficient.
Rick, what's your thoughts on that?
Look, yes, I'm a big believer in that model. That being said, that model is not applicable everywhere. Like we have tons of customers where they understand the security efficacy, and it's not the choice that they're going to make, right? So we have to consider customers need choices. Maybe I'm a huge engineering company that's writing these binaries. That being said, we'll look to what are you actually trying to do? You're trying to make sure that this third-party application is doing what it's supposed to do, right? It's essentially, if I run an accounting app, I want to know that, I'm able to, insert accounts receivable, accounts payable, all that stuff. And I also want to know if it goes wonky, right? But to do that, I have to deploy a piece of technology today. Let's call that piece of technology endpoint detection and response or modern EPP platforms, because I want to know if suddenly Flash makes a call to PowerShell, like that should never happen, right? And so it's like you have to say, I kind of trust this, but now I'm going to verify it. And so if you can't get into that prevention model, another strong model is pay attention to what these things are doing, gather the data to normalize it, and then be able to better detect when it goes wonky.
We're going to take one final question as well today. So, Tom, how much do you think CMMC will change the global security landscape?
I think it'll be a dramatic leap forward for those organizations that can implement it. But once again, this is all about integrating security controls, and it's all about facilitating continuous monitoring and ensuring that threats from within don't spread and threats from without, don't escalate.
Rick, do you want to add anything to that?
I'm hopeful. I mean, I come from a DoD background, right? So of course they need to vet their supply. Yes, we need to raise the level. However, I'm going to point back to the cyber skills gap that we have. So it's great that we do these things, but then who are the people to go audit it? Who are the people to do the attestations local? Who are the people to maintain the security technologies? And so I do agree that that's part of the issue, like what they're trying to do. However, we're not addressing the humans that are going to go do the work to actually make sure that this stuff's implemented. And so we still have, this glaring issue that, automation can't address something like that today. And we're still going to have to work towards it. But yeah, we're bottlenecking a bunch of functions that don't have the people that they need. So I'm hopeful, and I do think it represents like a massive move in the right direction. But now we got to figure out like how to execute on it.
Guys, this has been absolutely exhilarating. We've spent 45 minutes doing what we love on the VMware LinkedIn channel. First and foremost, let's say a big thank you to VMware for having us. for that point. That's been fantastic. And of course, goes without saying, of course, as Howlers, you are mentors for all of the cybersecurity community and also to VMware's community as well. So thank you for joining me today. Thank you for being great guests, as always. Also goes without saying, of course, that you can, you've probably seen the links coming up on the comments. So everyone listening in, you can not only grab the Global Insights report, there's 14 different reports available, but also I will make a plug. 2 weeks ago, Security Connect was live. It's now on demand. It is free. You can register and still get all of the content. You can hear from Rick. You can hear from myself. You can hear from Tom talking at Security Connect. But with no further ado, I'm going to close it out. Thank you so much for joining us today. Rick, TK, thank you for joining us as always. Take care. Good morning, good evening, good night.